Hi guys, welcome to part 7 of the design patterns video tutorial series. So from the last video we had this console logging event observer. A small optimization here is we're creating the visitor every time there's an event. This is not a good practice, so this implementation is better where our console logging visitor is instantiated during the instantiation of the observer, and it's going to use the same object every time there's an event. So this is just a small optimization from the last time. The next thing we're going to do is implement the JSON observer and the JSON visitor. So I've already implemented these. In the JSON observer, all we do is take in a JSON file path and then instantiate our JSON visitor, and then similar to what we did in the console logging observer, we ask for a string from the JSON visitor and then append that string to a JSON file. This append to string just takes that JSON string and appends it to the file in this file path. And then our JSON string visitor is similar to our console logging visitor. We put all the attributes in a map and call the assemble method. And then in the assemble method, it generates a JSON string based on these attributes. And it also adds event type and occurrence time to the JSON string. Now, as you can notice, our JSON string visitor and our console logging visitor have a similar structure. So both of them like assemble a string based on the attributes of the events. So this is somewhat of a duplication. We don't want to have this duplication in our code. So one design pattern that solves this problem is called the strategy design pattern, wherein we will define a string generation strategy, and then based on that strategy we will generate either a JSON string or a comma separated string and return that. So we will not have a duplicate logic of two files doing kind of the same thing. So let us take a look at the UML diagram of the strategy design pattern. It's very simple. We just have a strategy and then execute. So this is, in our case, it will be a string generation strategy. And then we have a JSON string generation strategy and a comma separated string generation strategy for the console. So let's go ahead and implement this. So I created a new package for our event string strategy, and then I defined this interface called string generation strategy, where we have one method called getString, and then we pass in the event and event attributes. And then we have a concrete class for console log string generation. So copied the logic from the previous file from the console logging visitor, and we generate the string for the console log. And here I copied the logic from the JSON visitor, and then we generate the string for the JSON file. So now that we have this, we're going to go ahead and modify our visitor. So instead of having two visitors for console logging and JSON, we'll only have one visitor called a string generation visitor. And then I'm gonna go ahead and delete the console logging visitor. So for our string generation visitor, we're going to, in the constructor, we're going to take in a string generation strategy. Now, once we have the string generation strategy, instead of calling assemble, we're going to remove this assemble. We're going to call the method on the strategy. So So here we have it. So we're going to call the string generation strategy.getString and return that string. So we only have one visitor, modify our observers. So instead of having a console logging visitor, we're going to have a string generation visitor and pass in the string generation strategy, which is our console logging string generation strategy. And similarly for our JSON observer, we're going to pass in one string generation strategy. So with this, we only have one visitor, which is the string generation visitor, and that takes in a string generation strategy. And then we made two strategies, a console log strategy and a JSON string strategy. And then in our observers, we for the console logging observer, we instantiate this visitor with this strategy. And for the JSON event observer, we instantiate the same visitor with the JSON string strategy. So the same visitor will give us different strings depending on what strategy we choose. Next, we want to register our newly created JSON observer into our events collector. So I instantiated the JSON event observer with this file name. So all our events will be saved in this file, and registered it to the publisher. So if we try to run it, I tried to run it and seems like it's running fine. So our strategy pattern is working well with our visitor and our observer patterns. And let me show you the JSON file that was generated. So the events were saved in the JSON file as well in this format. So seems like our first two requirements are satisfied. Next, we are going to implement the statistics part. So I started by creating a statistics event visitor. Implements event visitor void. So this is like a generic class for each statistics visitor, which will have a method called getReport aside from the methods found in the visitor. So we want to be able to generate a report. And if you recall from our requirements, initially the requirement is to just count how many of each event occurred, but our manager said that we might have more statistics generations later on. So in preparation for that, we make an abstract class called statistics event visitor, which has a method getReport. So for now we have only one visitor, which is event count. So all this does is count the number of events. So we have an integer for each event type, and then every time we visit, we just increment the appropriate counter. And then when getReport is called, it just returns a formatted report showing how many of each event occurred. And then for the observer of this one, so there's a statistics generation observer. So here we have a list of statistics visitors. So if we want many statistics to be generated, we will add more visitors to this class. And then when an event occurs, it just notifies everyone in the statistics list that to accept. It makes the event accept every visitor in the statistics event visitor list. And finally, in the events collector, we create the statistics event observer. So there's a method that configures it here and then registers it. So in the configuration, we create the statistics event observer and then add that visitor to our observer. And then we schedule the event count visitor to save the report in this file every 10 seconds, for example's sake. So this statistics report timer task is also a class that we created, and it looks like this. So we have a visitor and a file name, and then every time it runs, we call get report and save it to the file. So after running it, these are the generated files. So as you can see, the event count is being generated and our timer task is working. So here, when we registered the statistics generator, every time there's an event, the observer notifies this statistics generator, and then every time the timer task runs, it calls get report on that same object, so it is able to generate the report accurately. What I quickly want to do is move all this configuration related code into its own class. So let's call this event collector configuration, and then these two methods are the configuration related methods. So every time we want to like turn on a module or turn off an observer or add a new statistics generator, we would go in this file and configure it. So let me change this to protected or even default, so only the event collector can access this, and this one is private because this is accessed here. So in the events collector, we will delete this and call event collector configuration. So now this class is cleaned up and all our configuration related code goes here. So that is all for this video. In the next video, we will talk about how flexible our design is and test our design against certain use cases.